The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. We got a good quorum here. We'll get started here in a second. We'll let people trickle in. I'm going to put some polls up on the screen just to get a judge of who we have on the webinar. One second. Say, everyone. Hopefully, you can see my screen. I want to say thanks for joining. Oh, I'll wait 1 second here. Let a couple more people are still joining, but we'll get started here shortly. Sounds good. Now, like I said, so my name is Bryce Acer. Just a little bit about myself. Been in the web content management system space for a little over 6 years. I've used systems. I started out in Documentum. I've used SharePoint, Drupal, Communique, WordPress. And as far as migrations go, I've done a number of large migrations. I wet my teeth with a large pharmaceutical company migrating all their sites. They had about 30 different microsites within a Documentum installation for all the different drugs. And I've also participated in another very large migration with a large accounting firm. Also done some work with some state governments, specifically going from Documentum to SharePoint. And recently have had experience helping Adobe test out actually CQ55 and also with the migration of Adobe.com, which, as I show here, it was probably the largest migration that we have done is content-wise. It's about 1.5 terabytes on that site with a lot of very large videos and images, as well as the content, which goes into a number of different locales. They have about 30 or so different locales. So it's a very large site. Again, thanks for joining. So the purpose of this webinar, and we are going to host a number of different webinars via 60 Labs, but this one specifically to migrations and upgrades to Adobe CQ55, which was released earlier this year. And if you haven't had a chance to mess around with it, it is, in my opinion, a significant step forward in the CQ product. They have added some great functionality and also just improved the product as far as performance. So the purpose of this is sort of to understand preparation needed to do an upgrade or migration to CQ55. Explore the various methods that we have used, and see which ones fit in with your repository's profile, and also to help prevent and overcome common pitfalls, issues that have arose in the migrations that we've already done to prevent reinventing the wheel. All right. So the agenda, we're going to go through planning the upgrade migration, dive into the various methods for upgrading and migrating to CQ55, and then we'll talk about various issues, pitfalls that you can run into before, during, and after a migration. So planning your upgrade migration. What do you need to know about your repository? So first, I'd like to stress that the focus here today is going to be on migrating or upgrading a 5.3 or 5.4 repository to 5.5. If you have a system that is actually earlier than 5.3, I believe the recommended approach is to bring it up to 5.3 and then go from there. According to Adobe and dev.data.com, they actually do not support upgrades from CQ3 or CQ4 to CQ5, but they do provide a tool. And I'm sure the model is that you buy support from them, but they quote unquote don't support it. But I'm not trying to put holes in your ship and say you can't do it. It's definitely possible. And like I said, they do provide an upgrade tool. but that is a little bit more of an in-depth process for more of those legacy systems. So we're going to focus here today on going from 5.3 or 5.4 to 5.5. First and foremost, what you want to do is just analyze your current implementation and your content. This goes as far as listing all the customizations and extensions that you have, as far as your application goes, your content. Did you override any base CQ functionality? If so, how did you override it? Were you extending components? Did you just literally copy the out-of-the-box files from /libs and move them into your application? Did you create custom files and then leverage the out-of-the-box code? What files? Where are the locations of your files? All these are very important questions that need to be answered, in this initial phase before you dive headfirst into a migration. You'll find that the more that you know about the current state of your system, the easier it will be for you. Also, like to stress doing a health check as part of this analysis. Is your content, is your repository, are your components, are they all JCR compliant? One of the things that we have noticed in the difference from 5.3 and 5.4 to 5.5 is that they are doing a lot. I don't know if I call it better job, depending on your point of view, but they are definitely enforcing the standards much more vigorously with 5.5, and we'll get into some of that in the pitfalls we run into, but making sure that your content is JCR compliant, such as having JCR content nodes. You'll want to know if you're in or out of compliance beforehand, part of this analysis. Also, do you have any custom content types that might need to be handled differently than with the CQ content upgrader? Another thing is definitely, like I said, you want to know the paths of where all your customizations reside, as far as the /apps, /content, all the content there, and also anything under /Etsy, such as like /Etsy designs, anything /Etsy workflow, any customized workflows or anything you have there. Part of the in-place upgrade, the upgrade process of Dave's checks, is they actually just wipe out, literally delete locations from the repository. This is more specific to like the geometrics application, some of the out-of-the-box designs, such as like Etsy designs default, also the workflow locations. So you want to make sure that if you do have any content or configurations in these locations, that you back it up so that you can install it again in the new 5.5 repository, because they do, as part of the upgrade process, literally just delete and replace. This is more specific to like the geometrics application, some of the box designs and stuff, and the workflows. But that is something that you'll want to note. And also, do you have any custom workflows? Because specifically, there was a big change from 5.3 to 5.4, but also they did modify the whole, admin and the way workflows are displayed and used from 5.4 to 5.5 as well. So you'll have to upgrade your customized workflows, or run them through the upgrade process. And as far as also the health check and your content goes, as far as just compliance, and also it's a great time to do an analysis and see if you have any bad data in the system that doesn't need to be migrated, and that you could take this opportunity to possibly fix data that was possibly created with maybe buggy components, stuff that happened before a component was fixed, if there was issues and stuff, and that obviously over time in use with these repositories. Oh, and also admins have the ability to go in and just modify content through like the CRXD Lite and the CRX Explorer. Is there any bad data? This is a perfect time to be able to do that analysis and fix that. You'll just have a much easier and better time with the lifespan of your repository. putting in those putting in that effort at this point. After the analysis, it's pretty standard across the board, but you have to have a strategy and a project plan. You want to know what are the communicated timelines. When do people expect this new repository, especially the authors? I'm sure we all know people they want it right away, right? Well, it's obviously not realistic. This does take time, let alone the migration, but it's also testing. So create a realistic plan, and put a lot of time in there for testing the upgraded environments, as far as double checking all your customized components and making sure that they still work within the CQ55 framework. I know they worked in 5.3, but stuff, especially out of the box libraries, a lot of JavaScript and the way they handle like the CQ widgets, and the session variables and the context cloud and all that stuff has been modified significantly in some cases. So put in a lot of time for testing out not just the content and the look and feel of your site and the published aspect, but from the authoring perspective as well. And as far as also with your strategy and your project plan, make sure that you have a ample backup strategy. I'll be stressing that throughout this, but backup, and backup some more. It's not a difficult process, but there are, as I've obviously alluded to, pitfalls along the way. And, I'm sure everyone's on the same board with that, but the more you back up, the easier of a time you'll have, and you will run into issues. Also, I think a very important thing is creating metrics for success. How do you get that eventual sign off that the upgrade was successful? Is it fine to say that we are on 5.5, and even if we're leveraging some old 5.3 components and stuff, but the repository is 5.5, or is there performance metrics that are specific goals that people want to business might want to hit? It's very helpful to define those ahead of time so that throughout this whole process, one, you have the testing and the ability to measure these metrics of success, but also that these don't change and they are agreed upon beforehand. And I would say from all my experience, CQ55 is a significant step forward. And usability-wise, the speed of the authoring environment. You can also get more authors into using a repository at the same time. There's a lot more components. The components that are existing work much better, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of the new functionality that comes with 5.5. So it is definitely an upgrade we highly recommend. So also going along with planning your upgrade migration is deciding on what route to take. We'll talk through the various types in a little bit here, but there's essentially two main branches. One is doing an in-place upgrade, also called the jar replacement strategy. You'll probably see most of that from Adobe in their material. And then also another strategy is to create a new installation. So just a brand new 5.5 install and migrate the content from the old repository to the new repository. And there actually are two different methodologies of migrating that content. My personal recommendation is to do an in-place upgrade. It is the easiest, less moving pieces if you have a small repository. But when you get to medium and larger size repositories, I do recommend doing the migration approach. Just that in-place upgrade, that whole process with a large content size, it does seem to have some issues or take a long time with the larger the repository. So I recommend for medium and large repositories to do a new instance plus a migration of the content. Upgrading your CQ instance. The in-place upgrade, also called jar replacement. So preparing for a jar replacement, create test cases, areas of focus that you want to be able to test after the system comes up, after the upgrade hooks have been run. Back up your repository. I'm going to stress this a lot, but it really has saved me in a number of instances. Backup, backup, backup. That's either, creating a snapshot, doing a file system copy, or both. Especially when you're first starting this and you're working with the different dev environments and you're doing upgrades for the first time, you're going to run into a lot of issues. Have a backup readily available that you can just go to it and, do it again. And that will definitely help you in learning through this whole process. Also, what really helped us was having the legacy systems still remain available and up online. You can maybe move the ports if they're on the same server or whatnot. But just to have a reference or a comparison server, especially helpful for during the development phase, testing out various components and seeing how the functionality, if at all, has changed after post upgrade for maybe like your custom components and stuff. And then test the sign off metrics, performance, functionality. So upgrading the CQ instance is the jar replacement strategy, or the in-place upgrade. You stop the repository, replace your quick start jar with the latest version, so the 5.5 general release version, and start a repository. And then once it's started, test. And yes, it really is that simple. So one thing to note is so you're going to stop your repository, replace the jar, and to start it back up, you're either, depending on your system, if it's Windows, you can double click on the jar. If it's Unix, you're running the startup commands. Another thing of note, I've had better experience if the jars are the same name. So back in 5.3 and 5.4, and they're starting to phase out a little bit, but you could set up the type of environment where there's author or publish, as well as the port in the name of the jar. I've had much more success when the replacement jar, the new jar, the 5.5 jar that you're going to drop into the repository, is the same name as that jar was originally. So if you named it CQ-author-4502.jar, use that same name with the new jar. Also, while the upgrade is in process, so during that start phase, it'll take a while for the system to come up. It's running through a series of processes. First, when the jar starts, it does a check, and it notices that this is the first time it started under a 5.5 jar version, and it then calls the upgrade classes when it notices that the first time you start it. A really helpful thing is, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Linux Unix tail command. It's very helpful. I recommend that a lot, but tail the error.log, which is located under crx quick start /logs error.log. Tail that. That's where you'll see all the statements printed out from the whole upgrade process, and you'll be able to monitor what's happening, notice any errors immediately, and also see if you've gotten into maybe if it's stalled out or for any reason or having a hard time with specific content items during the upgrade process. So definitely monitor using that error log. Also, I do have a note here. Now, they do say that you can go directly from 5.3 to 5.5. I personally have had issues with this, and I've had the most success going from 5.3, doing the jar replacement to 5.4, and then doing another jar replacement from 5.4 to 5.5. That, personally, in my experience, has been the most successful method, and it's very reliable. Um, it seems hit or miss going directly from 5.3 to 5.5. Um, and another thing to note, and this is something we can follow up with later on. I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions after this, but there is a directory that is created during the upgrade process under /var/upgrade, and specifically, so when you go from 5.3 to 5.4, it'll create that directory var upgrade, and there'll be log files within that directory. Before doing the second upgrade from 5.4 to 5.5, you want to delete those log files, because then the next time it starts up, when you start 5.5 for the first time, it'll see those locations, those log files, and it'll say, oh, an upgrade's already happened. I don't need to do this. So you'll want to delete those log files. You can back them up somewhere or just move them out of that location. But before going from 5.4 to 5.5, you'll want to delete those upgrade log files, and it will start the upgrade process again from 5.4 to 5.5. And again, yes, it is really that simple. Obviously there can be some issues, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. But it's very straightforward, pretty easy. But again, like I said, I only recommend this for smaller repositories. So migrating to CQ55. So this is different than upgrading. This is a fresh install of CQ55, and we still have the old repository that has all our content in it, and we're going to migrate that content into the new 5.5 repository. And there's two different ways of doing that. So the first is what's called a package migration. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the package manager that comes with CQ. This is really as simple as bundling and packaging up your content in the source repository, your old repository, and downloading those packages and uploading and installing them to the new 5.5 repository. Important thing to note is that packages must be less than 2 gigabytes in size. Don't ever get bigger than that. Every once in a while it will work. Most of the time it will not. There were hard set limits in 5.4 and 5.3 that you can't create or install packages larger than 2 gigabytes. This size limit has been changed in 5.5, so you can now in 5.5 create packages larger than that. But I don't recommend it in this case for the migration, because you're obviously creating those packages in the source 5.3 or 5.4 repository, which do have issues and do have that hard set limit of 2 gigabytes. So, and it's, honestly, I wouldn't possibly, I'd say 1.8 should be your max, because at that point, you're getting close, and there's just issues, and as far as also just uploading the package in the first place, if they're a large size, depending on your latency to the server, it just takes a long time with the larger the package. But basically the strategy is chunking up all your content into one or multiple packages and starting up a new 5.5 instance, and then migrating those packages to the new instance. Similar like you probably do when you're installing or migrating applications and stuff like that. Another thing to note is that these packages then, what happens, and this is something that Adobe is moving away from, but definitely in 5.3 and 5.4, and from what I've seen in 5.5, when you upload a package into the repository, it's typically a zip file, and you upload that. And then when you install that package, what it does is it explodes that zip file into the repository. And but what happens is that original zip file also still remains in the repository. So now you've essentially doubled the size. So whatever your package size was, it's now in two forms in the repository. One still has the package that you uploaded, the zip file, and also exploded as the nodes installed into the repository. So um, you'll want to be cognizant of that. There are ways of removing those packages, but that's not really that straightforward. Um, and so that is one thing to note, that will essentially possibly up to doubling the size of the repository on the file system. Another thing with this is making sure that you have enough space within your temp directory. So whether that's /tmp on Unix or on Windows C:temp, whatever's configured for your operating system. Again, this is another thing that Adobe is trying to move away from, and also only use it sparingly during this process. But currently, definitely in 5.3 and 5.4, and from what I saw on all the initial loads of 5.5, when a package is being uploaded via the package manager, they first are taking that data and storing it in this temp directory, whatever your operating system's configured temp location is, and then sucking it into the repository from that point on. So we ran into issues where the repository was on a NAS, let's say, with tons of room, hundreds of gigabytes, maybe even terabytes. But the temp location was actually configured on a small drive. This is typical in Windows. If there's, a C and a D drive, the C just has the operating system and the D has all the data and is the large hard drive. Well, that C drive was only supposed to have the operating system on it, but out of the box Windows configures ctemp as the temporary directory. And if you're uploading a large file size, gigabytes worth, that directory can run out of disk space. And it's real hard to diagnose that. You definitely, again, like I said, monitor that error.log file. You'll start seeing stuff creep up in that in some sort of cryptic errors. Definitely Google it, and you'll figure out that your disk space is run out of room. And typically, what people will do is we'll look at the where the repository is, and there's plenty of room. I still have 200 gigabytes left. How could I be out of room? But you don't realize that this whole process uploading that package, it first stores it in the temporary location, and then imports it into the repository. And like I said, they are working currently on migrating or doing a different strategy there, or maybe putting the temp directory alongside the repository. But that's just something to note with the strategy here. The second migration strategy, and this is what this is the path that we went down with Adobe.com, is using File Vault. You might be familiar with File Vault. It's a tool that's shipped with CQ. At least as far back as 5.3. I think there's actually versions before that. But you can it comes with 5.5, 5.4, 5.3, and there are instructions on installing that on dev.data.com. With the newest versions of File Vault, which from the command line is VLT, it's the VLT command. The latest version that's shipped with 5.5 is 2.3.30. But as far back as 2.3.6 and maybe just version 2.3, the major version 2.3 of File Vault, a new command has been enabled, and that's the RCP command, or remote or repository copy. And so this command, like I said, is from the command line, or it's a batch script if it's run on Windows. It can run on either the destination server, the source server, or even a third computer instance, and it can migrate as long as it can reach via HTTP both repositories, the source and the destination. The source being your old repository and the destination being the new 5.5 instance. And what this does is it directly pushes content from the one server to from the source server to the destination server. So like I said, it does communicate over the network. The destination and the source don't have to be able to communicate, but wherever the command is run from does have to be able to reach both locations. So you can do it, if the server you're running the command from, maybe the destination, or sorry, the source is in the DMZ and the destination is behind your firewall. That's fine as long as wherever you're running this command can reach both locations. And also what I think is the best benefit of this is it's scriptable. Meaning, so it is essentially a Unix command or on Windows a batch command, and you can generate a migration shell script or a batch script to run the entire migration throughout the whole process, and also it's you are able to monitor that script. Let's get into the next step. Okay, so what you need to do to prepare for a file vault migration. Disable the workflows, and now specifically I'm talking about the destination server. And my note here is especially for DAM objects. This is something I definitely recommend. And now in 5.5, all the modules and all the out-of-the-box functionality is installed via the OSGI Felix console now. So it's very easy to turn on and off various functionalities of the product, and specifically in this case, the workflows. But what you should first do before running the migration script is go into the system console and disable the workflow API. This is because it's possible to run into a sort of a race condition where if you're migrating, content DAM from the source to the destination, when you while the migration is running and it's importing images into the destination repository, well, if the workflows are running, those listeners that are running in that repository will see that there's new image objects and start creating the renditions in real time for those images. But typically, when you're doing a migration, you already have the DAM objects in the source repository as well as also the renditions, because when they were uploaded into your source repository in the first place, those renditions were created by these same workflows. So you're going to be migrating the renditions as well. Well, what happens is it uploads the image and the CQ listeners see that new image and start creating these renditions. And meanwhile, your migration script is still then trying to migrate the renditions of that image, and it runs into a conflict because at first it checked and they didn't exist, but now when it's actually trying to post it, now they exist because somewhere in that process, the workflow created that rendition after it checked, but before it posted the content. And so that will have an adverse effect on your migration. And we'll get into that in the pitfalls here in a little bit. But the easy way to avoid that is while you're doing a migration, disable all the workflows in your system. And like I said, it's very easy now through the OSGI console to do that. There are various flags, aka options, for the VLT RCP command. Specifically for the VLT command, the one I highlighted here, and I'll talk about a couple more in a second here, but the most important is the xdavx depth equals 1. There is a content check that happens with the file vault command. out of the box. And if you don't set this flag here, the out of the box configured depth is 4. And I don't know exactly what happens, but basically they do a content check of the sibling nodes of whatever you are migrating. And even though they're not relevant and those aren't the nodes you're migrating, it'll still do a sibling check, and it'll check all the siblings down to the configured depth. So obviously the reasoning is the higher that depth is set to, the longer that content check takes. And we ran into cases such as, if we're migrating a path that's like /Etsy/Adobe, where a lot of configurations might be. It looks at that node, which is 2 levels deep. It's Etsy and Adobe. It goes to all the sibling nodes of Adobe, so everything in the Etsy directory, and we'll check all those. And it'll still do it with a depth of 1. You cannot set the depth to 0. But it'll check all those siblings. But if the depth is 4, which is the out of the box, it'll check all those siblings. It'll check all those siblings as children, and the children's children, and the children's children's children, to a depth of 4. And if you're familiar with your system, there's a sibling node of anything in Etsy that's Etsy workflow, and it'll go to an Etsy workflow, and then Etsy workflow instances, and within the Etsy workflow instances are objects representing all the instance workflows that are running in your system. And when we first ran into issues with this, before we even knew about this flag, just the initial check was taking hours upon hours, and also typically throwing out of memory exceptions for us, because it was so intensive. And we found out the reason why was because they had, and I'm sure most instances, or most repositories aren't typical like this. Like I said, it's a very large repository, but they had 3 million workflow instances running. And also within the Etsy instances location is all the workflows that I've also completed, but they still maintain objects in there for the audit trail. And so we were migrating something that had no relevance to that location, but because we didn't set this flag, it went, and the process was to check each one of those 3 million workflow instances, which obviously ground the whole migration to a halt. So that's very important when I've highlighted it here. I'll talk about some other flags here. There's a -R flag. This is also pretty important, and basically stands for recursive. So whatever node you specify, if you want to specify /content/.com being your web application /en, so the whole English locale, you can specify that node, and if you add the -R flag, it'll recursively do that node and all its children. So essentially that command will migrate the entire English locale. There's a -B for batch size, and I'll talk about that in -T, which is throttling, here when we talk about performance in a second. There's also a -U for update. And basically what that means is if the nodes exist, it updates the currently existing nodes, but if they don't exist, it doesn't migrate those nodes. And there's also a -N flag, which only has effect if you're doing an update. And what that does is it says only update nodes that are newer. So what it does is it does a comparison on the last modified date, from the source to the destination. And if the source is newer, it'll update the node. If it's not newer, it doesn't update the node. So that's great for when you're reusing these scripts after you've migrated your content. In a scenario, I'm working with Adobe right now where they have all the content in their production environment, and they want to propagate that production content throughout their QA and development and staging environments. And we'll use that -U with the -N flag to only bring the newer content in, and it significantly reduces the timing of the migration. And there's also a -E flag that stands for exclude. And what that allows you to do is add regular expressions to your command to exactly like it says, exclude specific nodes. So like in my example where you're migrating the English locale, you might specify the English locale, but there are a couple different child nodes of that you, don't want it to migrate. You can you can exclude them with a regular expression with the -e flag. There is also a custom log file with this command. Pretty sure it's SLF4J that it leverages, but you can make it as granular, verbose as you want. It has levels of debug, info, warn, and error for monitoring the vault copy as it's going. It's also great for as you kick off something and then you have the log to go reference to see if then there were any errors during any of your content migration. There's also a SPI log that goes with it that logs extremely granular on the creation of the content within the repository and what's actually going on. I don't recommend, well, depending on the size of your content, it's fine, but the SPI logs everything, and it can grow to very unwieldy log sizes. I mean, literally tens of gigabytes. it's that verbose. So if you're troubleshooting, it's very helpful, but I don't recommend turning on the SPI log during a standard migration. But definitely use the other log file. Yeah, and something that is very helpful that we set up with the log files, we set up a monitor too. As I said, the one large migration we did was 1.5 terabytes worth of content and images and videos. Well, to give you an estimate, that took about a little over a day and a half to run the whole migration. So it's very difficult to sit there and watch it, especially if you're watching the log file. Sort of like watching The Matrix, I guess. Scroll down your screen, but no one can really sit there for that long. So we set up a cron tab, cron job that just sent out an email every 15 minutes with the last 100 lines of the log file. And that we found that to be just a very easy, great way of monitoring these large migrations. And you can see if it's stalled out or run into any problems. And you don't have to be at your computer. You can, send an email to your smartphone or whatnot. So it's very, very useful. Performance. One thing during the initial phases is it's great to test for performance. Now, there's two flags, batch size and throttling. What the batch size is, and that's out of the box configured for 1024. Every 1024 nodes read from the source repository, it then saves into and writes to the destination repository. And with that batch size flag, you're able to configure that even down to 1. So every single read of a node, it'll save that. Or you can do it where it's 4,000 or 10,000 nodes. So that's something that you'll definitely want to test for performance tuning. And also in conjunction, there's a throttling flag that basically has a timeout period after a content save. So if you do a very large batch size, you might want to add a throttling so it doesn't start reading immediately after the save is called. Maybe there's like a 5-second delay that lets the data all be written to the hard drive. So those are two flags that are important through your performance testing while you're testing out your migration and getting the process all down. Another thing to note is you'll want to modify the out-of-the-box VLT command that comes shipped with the CQ55. And this is the same for the VLT that's with 5.3 and 5.4. Hidden in the script, they actually, it's very obvious the location. Just open up the VLT command and look at the script. But they have hard-coded the Java heap space to 256 megabytes. And if you see my next 2 points, for performance tuning, I highly recommend increasing the Java heap space and also the permgen. I think the permgen defaults to 256 megabytes, and we upped it to 512 megabytes. The permgen is not as important, but the Java heap space is a very important thing to configure. when we were running this, we was on a server with I think like 64 gigabytes of RAM, so there's plenty to be had, and we were running around with an 8 gig Java heap space size, which seemed to work really well. But if you don't modify that out of the box VLT command script, you're stuck at 256 because, like I said, it's hard coded in there to that 256. And a note on scripting. It's what we created were batch scripts or shell scripts. Actually, they were that ran multiple VLP RCP commands, and so we essentially the best way to put it is chunked out the content into manageable sizes, either to the locale level or even possibly deeper than that. And had a script that ran through all those content sizes. And so we had a list that we were maintaining of the content in a repository, and that script basically had a for loop, and it ran through all of the content locations that we had configured. And what that does is if any locations during the migration you run into errors or there's issues with specific content areas, well, it just moves past that to the next one on the list, and we'll run the VLT-RCP command again. And then once the whole migration script has run through, and when you're analyzing the log after the run, you can see the locations where that you might have had little blips or whatnot that need to be resolved. And you can go in there and just run those targeted areas again. Very, very helpful. And if you don't do any of that, I would recommend at least specifying the DAM content separately from the content. So /content/ your website name as one run, and /content/ DAM website name as a second run. It's very convenient to separate those two locations and have two runs at this. But the especially with the recursive flag, the VLT RCP command will just run through whatever node you pointed at, and all the children from that point on. So it's very, very powerful command, and it works really well. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, but we'll do our best to follow up via emails or whatnot. Let's get into issues since we are running those late here. What issues did we run into doing all this? And like I said, we have done all three of these different migration techniques, and depending on your scenario, it is there's room for using all of them. So I'd highly recommend getting to know the different techniques. But here are some different pitfalls. So the 503 unavailable issue. We see this a lot with the jar replacement strategy. I'm sorry. We don't see it a lot with the jar replacement strategy, but I've only seen this issue happen during this jar replacement strategy. And it's not typical, but maybe 10% of the time, what will happen is it runs through the whole content process, and then your server comes up, but every page you go to, you get 503 errors. Typically, this is an issue with the loading of the OSGI bundles. To resolve it, go into the OSGI console, which should be available, and see if there are any bundles that aren't started, and start those. If that doesn't work, shut down the repository, start it back up. A lot of times, those two methods will resolve this. If not, there's a third one that you can follow with me if you run into this, and I'll have more information on it. But you shut down the repository and delete the CRX quick start directory, as well as change the timestamp on the repository XML file to sometime. Actually, just remove the timestamp, and then start the repository back up, and it will go through and explode the whole /libs and basically the project again, and get you back and running. Sometimes the in-place upgrade, this is with the jar replacement strategy, freezes. You'll notice this. Like I said, you'll want to be monitoring the error log file during your upgrade. You'll see maybe a recurring error keep happening, or it just is doing nothing, and the server hasn't come up. This is not typical, but it does happen. And basically, it happens. you're just going to kill the Java process, shut it down, and start back over from your backup. Something went awry, and just start back up, and that's why we back up. I can't stress enough: back up, and back up. DLT, RCP, this is out of memory issues. I hit on a couple of those, depending on your batch size and how you configure that, and also the content size. If you're doing a migration of the DAM and you have your batch size really high, well, maybe you had a lot of videos, and a video can just be one node. So, maybe it's a 2 gigabyte video or who knows what, and run into these out of memory issues. So this is why it's very good to performance tune ahead of time. I know we're getting close here. The missing JCR content node. This is something I alluded to at the beginning when I said check the health of your content in your repository. We did run into a number of these issues, and it was that we don't know how it got into the repository, but there were content nodes in the repository that didn't have a JCR content child. That is against the JCR spec, is it 284 or whatever, says that each node has to have a JCR content node, child node. And it wasn't really enforced in 5.3 and 5.4, but now in 5.5 they are enforcing standards much more vigorously. And we did have issues with this content while trying to replicate. Specifically in the replication queue, it would get stuck in the replication queue. We were able to prevent this. We wrote a script, and this is something I can go into further detail after this webinar, where it did a check of the whole content repository and sort of did that health check. And that script also, as well, created and added JCR content nodes to nodes that were missing it. The path not found exception. There are two of those. One is possibly in the source, and if you find this and it's saying it's in the source, well, that path that you specified to the vault copy command doesn't exist in your source. So obviously you can't migrate something that doesn't exist. So you probably either have a spelling error or some type of logic error with the content location you specified. It also could be a problem with the destination repository. And if that's the case, typically what happens is you specified something too deep and the parent node doesn't exist. So if you specified to migrate content.com en products and the en locale doesn't exist, well, it doesn't know what to do with that node you're trying to migrate because the parent doesn't exist, and where does it put it in the repository? So you'll get that path not found exception for those. Lastly, the item exists exception. This is something that typically happens, like I was saying, when you're migrating the DAM objects with that race condition. And you'll see this in your error log if you forgot to turn off the workflows. And the best way to resolve this is to it's trying to migrate this node into the repository, but it already exists. And this will halt your migration if you run into this scenario. And the best way to resolve it is just to go into the destination directory and delete that node, whether it be through CRX Lite or the CRX Explorer. And then the new migrated node will get put into the repository, and it'll be able to move on with the migration. There's a couple of different issues. The different issues. There's obviously, I'm sure more that people will run into, but I'll be happy to talk through any scenarios that people have offline after this webinar. I'd like to say, thank you for joining us here. This is the first in what we hope to be a big series of webinars that we'll be hosting through 6 Dimensions and Six Dimensions Lab. Thanks all for joining. I hope it was helpful. If you want more information, please contact TJ. That's his email just right there. Or you can get more information about who we are and what we do at 60labs.com and also 6dimensions.com. So again, thank you, and have a great afternoon.